Hello and welcome to Inside Iraq. I'm Jassim Azzawi. A recent report issued by Amnesty International says tens of thousands of Iraqi detainees held without trial in Iraq for years remain at risk of torture. The report's title, New Order, Same Abuse, details thousands of arbitrary detentions, torture, severe beatings and ill treatment to obtain confessions and enforce disappearances. The report slammed the US for handing over the detainees to Iraqi authorities despite its knowledge of endemic torture in Iraqi prisons. Senior Iraqi officials deny the torture allegations, call the figures inflated, and criticize Amnesty for lack of coordination before writing the report.
Iraq officially took full control of its prisons in July. In an elaborate ceremony, the U.S. military handed over the last major American-operated detention facility, previously known as Camp Cropper. The Minister of Justice promised a new era.
The ministry will take the most serious of measures if mistreatment of prisoners is proven. Gone are the days when prisoners were treated inhumanely.
Ever since the American invasion and offenses at Abu Ghraib, prisoner abuse has been a sore topic in Iraq. Several scandals have been exposed over the past few years at Iraqi-administered facilities. Last year, the Minister of Interior visited Baghdad's Qarada prison to investigate allegations of torture at the notorious facility. And earlier this year, protests broke out in Mosul for days after reports emerged that Sunni Arabs from the northern city had been abused at a Baghdad prison, allegedly under the control of Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki.
Iraqi officials have acknowledged individual incidents of abuse along the years, but they staunchly deny that torture is systematic. They have promised several investigations, but the results of these investigations have not been made public, and Iraqis have not seen officials stand trial over the issue.
In a new report titled New Order, Same Abuses, Amnesty International estimates that 30,000 people are being held in Iraqi jails. Several are said to have died in custody, and that physical and psychological abuse is rampant. Iraqi authorities were quick to dismiss the report as inaccurate, with several officials appearing on local television stations defending efforts to stop violations.
In the past 4 years, the Ministries of Human Rights and Justice, in addition to the Justice Council and other entities, have cooperated and accomplished a lot when it comes to improving prisoners' conditions. We no longer have any detainees in Iraqi prisons without proper warrants, and on a daily basis, we resolve many cases so that no one lingers without a trial.
Critics argue, however, that Iraqi security forces wield broad arrest powers and heavily depend on personal confessions and tips, information that is easily distorted and often subjective. This has led to calls for reforming the Iraqi judicial process itself, with U.S. officials saying they're training Iraqis to use scientific-based evidence and forensics instead. Rawi Rageh, Al Jazeera, Baghdad.
To discuss the report by Amnesty International and accusations of massive human rights abuse in Iraqi prisons, I am joined from Baghdad by Talib al-Hamdani, the Director General of the Follow-up and Coordination Department at the General Secretariat of Iraqi Council of Ministers, and from London by Malcolm Smart, the Director of Middle East and North Africa Program at Amnesty International, and from Washington by David Pollack, a senior fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. Gentlemen, welcome to Inside Iraq. Malcolm Smart, let me start with you. I was struck by a quote you have given, and that let me just read it to you to make sure that I read it correctly. It says, Iraq's security forces have been responsible for systematically violating detainees' rights, and they have been permitted to do so with impunity. Looking at this statement, this is nothing short of a massive indictment of the entire Iraqi judicial system. Basically, you are saying the government is sanctioning this abuse.
Well, I fear that's the case, and although we have many public statements to the contrary from the government, as your previous report has shown, there have been now a number of incidents where secret detention prisons have been located. The government has said it's carrying out investigations. Those investigations have not achieved any outcome that we know of. Officials accused of torture have not been brought to justice as far as there is information to show. And at the same time, we, Amnesty International, get constantly reports from families, from detainees, of people who are missing, who have been tortured in detention, and that's what we're drawing attention to. We recognize that some attempts have been made by the Human Rights Ministry, the Justice Ministry, to bring things under control. But there's a long way to go yet, and much more needs to be done.
Mr. Al-Hamdani, immediately upon issuing this report, Iraqi government officials were quick to draw a distinction between numbers. No, it's not 30,000 as Amnesty International alleges. It's only about 15,000. I'm not going to play the number games with you, but in the face of overwhelming evidence of massive human rights abuse and torture in Iraqi prisons, denial by itself is not going to serve anybody, especially the Iraqi government.
Yeah, of course, it's not going to serve. To play the numbers is not my intake into this report. In fact, it's a breathtaking report. I read the whole of it. In fact, the Council of Ministers Secretariat are reviewing the report by the legal departments there. And I as head of the follow-up department, I will gonna follow the recommendation, what we're gonna do about it. In fact, I contacted many of my colleagues, the Justice Department in Iraq, the Ministry, and also the Ministry of Human Rights, and even the security councils here. And they're going to cooperate, and they say there is no, in fact, coordination between the Amnesty International and them. They would have opened the jails for them to investigate every allegation there is, but they say they never heard anything from Amnesty International at all.
Well, let's leave the coordination aspect aside. Are you and the Iraqi government basically are saying that there is no abuse, there is no torture in Iraqi prisons? I mean, aside from the follow-up,
no,
and we are going to do that, and we are going to do this, you are not denying, are you, that torture is endemic in Iraqi prisons?
In fact, Jassim, I lived in the US for almost 25 years. I used to head one of the organizations monitoring human rights abuses during the previous regime. We used to knock the door on Amnesty International, give them reports of abuses in Iraq. In fact, this report, just give us a wake-up call that we need to do more. We at an administrative arms of the Council of Ministers, we're going to follow up all the allegations in this report to the minor details, and we encourage Amnesty International to come to Baghdad to give us a call. And
that's a wonderful notion, Mr. Al-Hamdani. We shall find out whether such promises as have been made in the past, over the past 6-7 years, will materialize. But let me go to Mr. Pollack, and let me do another thing, and that is quote something also from a report. It says, yet the US authorities, whose own record on detainees' rights has been so poor, have now handed over thousands of people detained by US forces to face this catalog of illegality, violence, and abuse, abdicating any responsibility for their human rights. If there is one entity, Mr. Pollack, quite aware and knowledgeable extensively about the human rights abuse, is the American forces in Iraq. In light of that knowledge, why did they hand over tens of thousands of Iraqis to Iraqi authorities, knowing full well some of them, if not a great segment of them, will be tortured?
I think, Jassim, that we have to begin by noting that Iraq is now a sovereign, independent country. And you, of all people, who have argued for so long that the American occupation of Iraq should end, should, I think, recognize that as part of ending that occupation, which we are doing, the transfer of responsibility and full sovereignty to Iraq is taking place. And that is something, in my opinion, to be applauded, even, I hope, by you.
Indeed, I would applaud that massively. Indeed, I would applaud, and like you said, we called for the ending of this occupation. But I'll let you finish before I come back to you.
Thank you. And so, as to your point about responsibility for prisoners and detainees, This is now an Iraqi responsibility. And therefore, I was happy to hear the representative of the new democratic government of Iraq, who, as he said, was a political exile under the brutal, tyrannical Saddam regime that tortured not thousands, but millions of Iraqis in its prisons over 30 years. I was happy to hear Mr. Hamdani from Baghdad acknowledge that there is a need for the Iraqi government to do more, to investigate and to stop any abuses that are taking place. And today, in the new democracy that is Iraq, there is at least a reasonable prospect that that will happen and that these abuses, such as they are, will end.
Shouldn't have the American forces acquired and asked for and demanded guarantees from the Iraqi authorities to prevent torture in Iraqi prison, Mr. Smart?
Well, the American and Iraqi governments made a status of forces agreement at the end of 2008, which covers the withdrawal and the handover of prisons and prisoners. And there's absolutely no human rights safeguards written into that, which is quite astonishing. We raised that at the time, and nothing has been done. And we've seen this process of handover. Indeed, we cite in our report cases actually of people who've been detained in some cases for years by the US forces without any charge or trial or without any independent tribunal that they can go to challenge their detention, who the American forces have recommended for release but actually haven't been released by the Iraqi government. They were handed over to them. So there's a big question about the US role and its failure to uphold the human rights principles that the US has once spoken so highly for.
Mr. Al-Hamdani, we have heard over the past several years about investigations, and that report will be published about the human rights abuse in Iraqi prisons. And to the best of my knowledge, we have not seen a single report about that. And I'll ask Mr. Smart to correct me if he's aware of any report. And yet, day after day, we keep discovering secret prisons like Al-Muthanna prison. We discover Al-Jadiriya prison, where torture was carried out by none other than a minister, the Minister of Interior, who was later promoted to become the Minister of Finance. So people listening to this program and people watching the Iraqi human rights scene, they are not encouraged, are they?
Well, in fact, Jassim, as you know, we have come a long way. I mean, to hear this report, and we discussed in it. And as you know, Iraq is a new democracy, is experiencing this. At least within our structure system, there is no systemic structure to do oppression, not like the previous regime. There is no systematic process to prosecute people and take their rights off. In fact, we have a culture of oppression. All these security officials, they used to work in the previous regime, now they work in this regime. We need to monitor them more. We need to change the culture of oppression. We need to do a lot of training, and we need to make them accountable. So all this will take a long way. I mean, it's not going to happen in just overnight in 5 years. It's just like a new democracy, just a baby. We need to work hard, me and you, all Iraqis, to make this system better.
It's been many years, Mr. Hamdani. It's been 7 years, and this culture of oppression, this culture of torture has to come to an end, and has to come to an end very fast. But let me go to Mr. Smart.
Inshallah.
Well, fine. When we discuss such issues, such grave issues, and that is torture and killing, one is reminded by what the Soviet leader Stalin said. He says that the death of a man is a tragedy, but the death of millions is just a mere statistics. When you look at cases and you have cataloged some of them, for instance, we have the case of Mr. Riyad Mohammed Saleh. Can you just briefly tell us what happened to him?
Well, what's happened typically in cases is that people have been taken away. They've disappeared from sight. Their families haven't found out where they are for long periods. And then they've turned up in prison, and they've basically said, in many, many cases, that they were tortured and ill-treated. They were forced to make confessions. Sometimes they weren't even seen. They weren't able even to see what they were made to sign, but they feared these were confessions to crimes that could indeed incur the death penalty. And what we've seen is the judicial process is one which is based on a confession approach. International law, international fair trial standards prohibits the use of evidence or information obtained under torture as evidence in a court, yet that's routinely been accepted. I'd just like to make two other points, if I may. We have actually repeatedly raised our concerns with the Iraqi authorities on individual cases and also with the US forces, and our response has been we have had very little response from there. The other point I would make is that the question of impunity is really the big one, and it should not take a massive amount of time. Impunity, like a journey, it can start with a small step. Let's see the outcome of the investigations into the serious allegations of the secret prisons. Let's see the outcome of that. Let's see the prosecutions, and let's also have the secret prisons run by the Defense Ministry and the Interior Ministry brought into the system. The Minister of Human Rights has called for them to be brought under the Justice Ministry. It still hasn't happened. Why not? What's going on in those places? Where are those places? How many people are held? And why is the government looking the other way?
I fear these questions will not be answered, Mr. Malcolm Smart, given the history of recent investigations. I just alluded to the Al Jadariya and to the former Interior Minister, who is Bayan Salah Jabr, who is now the Minister of Finance. He himself admitted that torture was carried out under his own very building, and then he just quibbled about the numbers. No, they are not 147. We only tortured 47. So that tells you where we are heading. But let me go to Mr. Pollack regarding the responsibility. Mr. Smart mentioned that the SOFA does not stipulate anything about responsibility. I would like you to comment on that, because we will be hearing in the next phase that some of the tens of thousands handed over to Iraqi prisons officials, they might be tortured.
I think the comment that needs to be made is that, as Mr. Smart acknowledged, the SOFA, the agreement between the American and the Iraqi governments, provides for the transfer of sovereignty and full responsibility to Iraq over every area of Iraqi policy and practice. And that, of course, includes the justice system and the prison system, so that the responsibility rests with Iraq, not with the United States. And I think I would also cite repeat, actually, another point that Mr. Smart...
If I may say, this includes prisoners who have been detained without trial by U.S. forces on information obtained by U.S. forces, and then just freely handed over to the Iraqi authorities. How can that be right?
Yes, and the responsibility now, as you pointed out, according to the SOFA, rests with the Iraqi government, not with the United States. And you also pointed out, Mr. Smart, correctly, that there were many cases of prisoners who were recommended for release by the American authorities in an attempt to secure their human rights going forward. And if those recommendations were not taken by the Iraqi government, that responsibility, again, rests with the Iraqis, not with the Americans.
Let me add to that and divert it to Mr. Al-Hamdani about the recommendations. Not only the Americans, they suggested and recommended the release of many prisoners, but actually a court order by Iraqi courts demanding the release of prisoners were never carried out. Add to that the 2008 amnesty for prisoners that they've been held anything between 6 months to 12 months, and some of them, they are languishing in Iraqi prisons for years without any charge, without any interrogation, except for torture. They have not been released. So when you say we are a new democracy and we are going to do this and we are going to do that, that actually does not cut any ice with anybody.
No, it does. In fact, America and their constitution gave the freedoms and rights to all citizens, but it took like hundreds of years for the blacks to get their rights. So check and balances within the system.
Careful,
is not
Mr.
like
Hamdani. Careful, Mr. Hamdani. Are you saying we have to wait 100 years?
No, I am not saying that. I say in 7 years, or in fact in 5 years since we have election, we are talking about a very serious subject, about this issue that we never used to discuss during the past
Answer my question directly. When a court judge
in fact, this is a breathtaking report.
Mr. Hamdani, answer me directly. When a judge says, release this prisoner because there is nothing against him, why is it that top of the militias who are in charge of these prisons don't release them?
Why? Because there is the executive branch and there is the judicial branch, and sometimes in democracy, in weak democracy, they don't work together. We are building this new democracy. We are trying to establish a very strong state, and we are discussing about a very serious issue, and we try to find a better way to make the states function very well. So I look at it when the American hand over the prisoners to the Iraqi, the Iraqi politician will be responsible. They will be accountable before the Iraqi people, before the Iraqi judicial system. So I look at it as a very good sign that this prisoner will be handed
Perhaps
to
from
Iraq.
your perspective, Mr. Hamdani, you look at it as a very good sign.
Yeah.
Others they will disagree with you and they will say, where does he live? Of course, they see you sitting there and comfortably, but looking at the Iraqi prisoners being tortured in Iraqi prisons, it's a completely different story. Mr. Smart, talk about the confessions and talk about people brought blindfolded before an interrogator and asked to sign a statement. Some of them, they ended up dying because of confessions they have signed, not knowing exactly what it was.
Well, that's what we fear. It's very difficult to know in some of these cases because, of course, the Iraqi government has also been carrying out large numbers of executions and doing that also largely behind closed doors and without revealing the details. But certainly what the picture that emerges
Smart,
is that...
If you don't know the details, why are you making this wild accusation that the Iraqi government has been carrying out large numbers of executions? I don't think you have a shred of evidence. You don't have, by your own admission, you have not a shred of evidence to support that wild statement.
We have information on a number of executions, and we have made that in the public domain.
Large
we have called on the Iraqi government.
30 seconds ago, Mr. Smart, you said large numbers of executions. Are you now retracting that statement?
No, I believe there have been large numbers of executions, and I'd like the Iraqi government to disclose publicly how many executions they are carrying out.
Let him finish, Mr. Pollack. Let him finish. Let him finish.
Do you believe that this number is a large number?
Let him finish. Let him answer.
Please.
On the basis of statements that have been made, including within the Iraqi judicial system, reports that we've received of large numbers of people on death row and executions, reports of cases
I am sorry,
that we've received.
Once again, you are changing your story even as you speak. You said large numbers of executions. Now
unfortunately, we have reached to the very end of the show, gentlemen.
Well, we seem to be back to the numbers game, and that's
this is not a game, Mr. Smart. This is not a game at all.
Certainly,
this is a matter of life and death.
Gentlemen, thank you for being guests on Inside Iraq.
Thank you very much, Jassim.
To watch the show online, please visit our website, aljazeera.net/English. We have reached the end of this show. Join me next week when we take another look inside Iraq. Until then, this is Jassim Azzawi wishing you a wonderful week.